How you doing, Covenant Church? I've heard over the last 30 days as we've been staying at home that some of you are struggling with boredom. I know I've heard that around our house over the last few weeks. Oh, I'm so bored. There's nothing to do. I've done my best to sympathize with that. I really have. The fact of the matter is, I've made the most of my time. I really have. And I've managed to master several activities that have kept me from being overcome by boredom. Here, check it out. Scored it. Grilled it. Grew it.
Lost it.
Won it. Read it. Most of it. Trained it. Solved it. Working on it. Even if I can't exactly relate to being bored, I know someone who can help us with this problem. His name is Dr. Richard Winter. He is a professor emeritus of counseling at Covenant Theological Seminary. He has also written a book about boredom. Still Bored in a Culture of Entertainment, Rediscovering Passion and Wonder. This might be what you need to hear right now. And in this interview, we go through many of the ideas he discusses in this book about what it means to overcome boredom, and specifically what the Bible has to say about overcoming boredom. Hey, just a quick heads up. We had some technical difficulties toward the end of the interview. It's not you, it's me. Just keep watching to the very end and enjoy. And so a few weeks ago, I reached out to Dr. Winter and asked him if he'd be willing to talk a little bit about boredom, since as I've talked to folks at Covenant Church, this is an issue that they've been wrestling with. And so, Dr. Winter, thanks for taking some time to speak with us.
You're welcome.
And I guess my first question would be, when I initially emailed you, you were at least a little bit surprised that there were a number of folks dealing with depression, not in a judgmental way at all, but you perhaps thought there were other things that may be rising to the surface. But I'm curious why your first response was a bit of surprise that boredom would be at the top of the list. Maybe I misread your response.
People dealing with boredom, you said depression, you meant boredom.
I meant boredom, you're right.
Yeah, well, it was partly coming out of my own reaction, because it was a few weeks ago at the beginning of our shutdown, and I felt like I had plenty to do, and I'm not a person who easily gets bored. I usually have projects going and things to do, and so we slotted into a rhythm and ritual of dealing with this. But that it depends so much on circumstances, I think, because I'm not alone. I have my wife here, and I have plenty of communication with my adult children and my grandchildren via Zoom and WhatsApp and Instagram and with friends too. But I can see that for people who are lonely, have no one else, and now we're into the, I don't know how many weeks it is, but I can feel the boredom creeping up on me. This is getting tedious. It's getting awkward. I want to. But thankfully, we've been able to get out, and we walk a lot, and we go bird watching and Forest Park, and things like that. And that hasn't been restricted. And I think it's for people who don't have a lot of interests, and who have come to depend on digital technology, on Netflix and on texting friends and maybe who don't read much and so on. It's a pretty tough time, because you can get bored with all the electronic stuff coming in, and maybe we'll get to that a bit later on. So I think it depends so much on circumstances, but my initial reaction was, yeah, I'm certainly not bored, but I can understand why some people are.
Yeah, it's right. And I've had conversation with friends and church leaders and teachers who are saying, I've got more to do now than I did before this ever started. So that's certainly the
All,
case for lots of folks.
all my kids are wrestling with homeschool and work at home, and they're just spinning with it all.
Well, that might
Yeah,
be a good place to start then um, to define boredom, only because um, it seems to me that we could be mistaking other things for boredom. We can talk about that in a moment. I made a flub a few minutes ago and mentioned depression because I do want to talk about that. I think in your book you link boredom and depression in some important ways. But do you have a working definition of boredom that would be helpful for us, just in terms of diagnosing what it is we're wrestling with?
there are two types. One is the sort of passing boredom of, not having enough to do, being in a boring lecture, boring sermon, um, and a tedious task. And those things we can remedy by walking out of the lecture, or we can go to sleep, or we can find some other distraction. We can turn to our cell phones, as we so often do. It's interesting just watching people in the lines outside the grocery store. They've all got their heads down and they're all looking at their phones because they're so bored waiting to get in. But they have that instant entertainment or connection on their phones, which is a mixed blessing, I think. Um, so that's the sort of passing type. And then the more permanent type, I think, is the sort of monotony of life. Maybe if you're having to do very repetitious tasks, and there's lack of challenge, you're lonely, you have nothing to do that really stimulates your interest. And even more so, I think, if you don't have a sort of bigger picture of life, there's an existential type of boredom, which is very deep, which is, what's the point of life? What's the meaning of life? I can't change my circumstances to get rid of that one unless I find some overall meaning and purpose to it all. So I think we can talk about those two types, and the first, the understimulation, the repetition, the lack of motivation in doing things, and then the more existential type of boredom.
What about the sort of boredom that, as you talk about in your book, would be a symptom of underlying depression? How would you go about helping someone work through that or sort through that?
Yeah, it's important to make that distinction, I think. And it's been actually historically, there's a long history of making that distinction, which maybe we'll come on to again in a minute. But I think you can see them as three overlapping circles: depression, grief, and boredom. And because there's a sense of lack of interest in life and apathy and disconnection in all of them, in depression, in grief, and in boredom. But in depression, you also have other symptoms of depression, such as maybe decreased appetite, difficulty sleeping, and a sort of constant feeling that life is hopeless and meaningless, and you may be tearful, sad, and it is a deep sort of level of feeling that. And then grief, which has similar symptoms to it, except that grief tends to go in waves, and there's a very clear loss that you're reacting to. Whereas in depression, there's not always a clear loss that you're reacting to. So I think there are similarities, but it's important to distinguish them, and helping people with them would be on three different tracks.
One of the statistics that stood out to me, some of the statistics that have stood out to me are what we're learning about how folks are using their time during the pandemic. I shared some of those with you because I wanted your thoughts on them. I'll throw a few out at you, and you can respond. And I'm thinking these are reliable statistics. They make sense to me anyway, and I've seen them corroborated in other places as well. That since the end of March, at least this is in the U.S., that alcohol sales are up 55%. Marijuana sales are soaring in places where it's legal. Internet pornography traffic is up 6%. And according to Fitbit data, that's the wrist exercise monitor,
Mm-hmm.
according to their consolidated data, people are moving less physically. So part of the reason I picked those out is because I found those same trends in your book, as you talked about what sometimes we do with our boredom and the ways that we poison ourselves in certain ways during our boredom and turn to things that are ultimately unhealthy. I'm wondering if you can just reflect on those statistics and what that might say about ways in which we're not dealing with boredom well during this time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're all pointing to ways that we deal with discomfort and pain, and boredom being a part of that. But I think there are so many things that we're all experiencing, with the anxiety, the fear of death, the loss of jobs, the loss of normal routines, the stress of homeschooling, and care for children, the stress of grocery shopping, and all sorts of things that, and these things point to somewhat dysfunctional ways of dealing with stress, that we tend to fall into our often addictive patterns of using alcohol, using drugs, using sex. I'm surprised the porn stats aren't higher than they are, actually. To ease our pain, to distract us from it, and really not dealing with it in very healthy ways. And I think people are not exercising as much, when in fact they need to exercise more at times like this. But that may be restricted for some who may, in some countries, whether you can't even leave your home and you don't have anywhere to go, like we have close by here in Forest Park.
At one point, you suggest that boredom can be a welcome sight, and honestly, I can't remember if that was a quote from someone else or if those were your words, but that stood out to me, because I think folks who are bored right now and looking for something to do, looking for some stimulation, do not feel like boredom is a welcome sight. I know you're not making light of it, but you are suggesting maybe we can learn something from it.
Yeah, I think learning to tolerate boredom and to find ways to get yourself out of it without just turning on the electronic entertainment media. We tend to do that when our kids are bored or grandkids are bored. You just turn on the TV or put them on the internet, onto a game or something. And those are all good things in small quantities. But I think there's a tendency that because we've become so dependent on the electronic media, that we've lost the art of entertaining ourselves, and we're losing our imagination. As some writers on this topic talk about the shriveling of our inner resources. So we're losing the capacity, our imagination. We're so dependent on external things. So to actually have a child, invent games, or to do, when I was younger, we were put out in the yard to play, in the garden to play, and we made up games, and we created things out of, old wood that might have been lying around, but that's far, I think people are losing the ability to do that. So that the pain of boredom ideally stimulates you to be creative, and maybe in the bigger picture to ask the big questions of life, of why am I so bored? Why does life seem so meaningless and purposeless? And maybe I need to look for answers in that.
You touched on something there, this idea of overstimulation. I'm just thinking from a medical, physical, mental standpoint. how overstimulation can have the opposite effect, right? So if we're overindulging at this point in screens, which probably all of us are guilty of to some extent, it can actually feed boredom because of overstimulation. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I talk about it as this phenomenon of being entertained to excess. That when we're surrounded by so much information coming at us on the internet in various forms, and we find it hard to sort out what's relevant and important, and it sort of begins to lose meaning. So you get lost in so much stimulation, and if you don't have a clear vision of what life is about, you just go from one entertaining moment, something that makes you feel alive, to another. And so I talk about this phenomenon of surfing the internet in order to find something that makes us feel alive, that entertains us, that gives us a sort of almost an adrenaline buzz. But the problem is it doesn't last long. You know, it may entertain you for a while, and then you're on to the next one, and then you have to binge on Netflix to get the same sort of satisfaction from it. And I think we all find ourselves easily addicted to Netflix for that reason. So it's Aldous Huxley in Brave New World talked about people. He says people will come to adore the technologies that undo their capacity to think. People will come to adore the technologies that undo their capacity to think, and truth will be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Truth will be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. And that's what I fear, is that we get lost in this world of entertainment, and pleasure becomes the purpose of life.
Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't have to be a screen that would do that. There are certainly people who were chasing the same buzz and the same pleasure hit 150, 300 years ago. And I mean, we see that in Ecclesiastes and other places as well. But the screens and just the instant access to so much brings its own set of problems. One encouraging trend, I think I can say this is encouraging, is perhaps out of boredom, I've seen more people creating with technology as opposed to just consuming. We had a student in our church who was doing a skill challenge every day. He would learn a new skill, whether it was doing Rubik's Cube or playing the guitar or something, and then he would post a video of him mastering that skill and challenging others. I thought that was a great creative way to use technology in the ways that you're talking about it, in a way that encourages more than just consumption.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And we've been thrilled with sort of the way our grandchildren have taken to this in positive ways. And 3 of our 7, 9, and 12-year-old have produced a podcast, which they do weekly, which has been really creative and fun. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. There are positive things. I think it's just that if you think of what would we do if we had a power cut for this length of time with no electronics at all, we're back in a world where, you just have to make music with each other. You have to tell each other stories. You have to produce a lot of your own food, and that takes up nearly all your time.
Yeah.
The pre-industrial, rural, agricultural world.
You offer this fascinating family tree in your book, and I guess we've sort of turned back to diagnosis a little bit, but I want to talk about it because it does get us to a place of understanding our boredom and even learning from it, learning something about ourselves maybe. When you trace boredom and maybe that existential boredom that you talked about to medieval Christian theology. I mean, boredom has been something that theologians, Christian theologians, have been thinking about in terms of scripture and a biblical worldview for a long time. Can you just give us a few ideas that they were talking about and working with that would be helpful for us in that
I'll try
regard?
to do it simply. It's a complicated, that's quite a complicated chapter in the book. But, and by the way, the word boredom came into the English language in the 1700s. And the French had the word ennui, which was sort of to annoy. And being bored, you feel annoyed, whether it's someone who's boring you with a long, who never listens when and you want them to listen. But there was an older word that was used in the sort of with the early church fathers in the Middle Ages called acedia, acedia, which literally means without care. I don't care about anything anymore. It's a sort of, the contemporary word would be whatever. That's how I feel about life. And the desert fathers described this what they described as the noonday demon, giving them thoughts of, I don't care about God anymore. I'm bored with everything. I'm dissatisfied with life. And then the word sloth came into the English language with, and the sort of, and these both sloth and acedia were regarded as one of the 7 deadly sins. So it was something you were responsible for. And it was a sort of like a choice to turn away from God and from goodness and the contemplation of goodness and beauty. But some of the monks were not quite so hard on themselves and recognized that, gosh, they had a lot of pretty boring, monotonous tasks to do, and maybe it wasn't all their fault. And then later, there was a recognition that there are 2 strands to acedia. One is this idleness, indolence aspect, which is the one you're really responsible for, the sin you're responsible for. And the other is more melancholia and depression, the sadness side. So they saw that depression and boredom overlap here, and there are different causes. So the latter, the melancholia, was more a disease to be cured rather than a sin to be repented of and resisted. And from then, acedia, from probably the 1600s, it faded from the English language and was replaced much more by sloth and laziness, and then depression was a separate phenomena.
And as you've talked about those, in your book, you certainly make the connection to Genesis chapter 3, well, the first 3 chapters of Genesis, but certainly Genesis chapter 3, in understanding a certain aspect of boredom as encountering the effects of the fall, living in a broken world where there are thorns and thistles. So I think that could be helpful for folks too, as they're watching this, to understand their experience, maybe to go a little easier on themselves, to recognize this is what they're experiencing now as part of living in a world that isn't the way it's supposed to be. How would you counsel along those lines for folks who are feeling boredom and maybe framing it with that idea that we find in Scripture?
There are, in a fallen world, I think there are inevitably things that are boring. There are tasks that we have to do to push back against the effects of the fall, and to push against disease and laziness and all sorts of things that are sort of inevitably somewhat boring. And if you don't have that big picture of why things are the way they are, why there are thorns and thistles, and why agriculture and gardening is such a tedious thing when you don't have a lot of help to do it, then I think it seems very, very pointless. But with the big picture, we can see both sides of both the glory and the beauty in God's world, as well as the fallenness and depravity and brokenness of it. So yeah, there is that aspect, and I think there's also there are some things in life, that that are repetitious, but when you have a meaning, when there's a purpose for that repetition, such as a musician has to practice hour after hour to be good at what they do, or an artist, you do a lot of repetitive tasks. Cooking is a lot of repetitive tasks. Mowing the grass, you do it again and again and again. But when you can see it in the big picture of the overall purpose of creating a place of beauty or creating beautiful music, that helps to take away some of the sting of boredom.
So it sounds like you're actually going past Genesis 3, even though that's still very much in play, to Genesis 1 as a way out of boredom, or at least as a way of coping with boredom, understanding ourselves as creatures, and that foundational mandate for us to be living in God's world and enjoying it and enjoying him through it. Can you share a little, and I know you talk about this in your book quite a bit toward the end, how that perspective of creation does reintroduce passion and wonder into our lives in a way that's ultimately really helpful as we find ourselves bored.
Yeah, I think there are as you said, the two sides of it. One, just going back to Genesis 3 for a moment, is there is so much brokenness in the world that we need to weep over and feel compassion for. And the word compassion meaning to feel with, feel deeply about, and to push back against. And that gives us plenty to do and think about, and caring for our neighbors in this, for instance, in this situation, and pushing back against the virus wherever we can. That's one side. The other side is noticing the glory and the beauty. And this spring has been just stunning in terms of creation and the long stay of the blossoms because of the cool weather, and learning about the creation and enjoying it. And that's why that was something for me, with that bird watching was such a wonderful thing, because then when I learned to listen and to hear the birds, it opened a whole new world to me. And yesterday we were out in the park and we saw an osprey there, which is very unusual, and a Baltimore oriole, which is just stunning in its beauty, and the song is incredible. So it's just sort of opening up of one's interests to the goodness of God's world. Maybe it's in cooking, in bread making, in making music, in art, in humor, and just in care for our bodies, in exercise. And I found getting out and having a really good hard long walk every day and doing a bit of yoga and stretching has been incredibly important. And that's an important way of caring for and being thankful for our bodies and the world God has put us in. And it's hard to be bored for long if you're able to open up those interests. What I fear is that so many kids today and young people are defaulting to electronic media and losing their being in touch with the creation, and losing the internal ability to be creative with their time and energy. Maybe the last thing that was going through my mind a bit earlier on was the whole theme, and you mentioned it, of Ecclesiastes, where it's every book in the Bible. The doctor is trying everything to assuage boredom with life and to find meaning and purpose. And he tries just about everything, wealth and women and possessions, and none of it deeply satisfies. And he comes back to this refrain, which seems to be the sort of view of the world from above rather than just the horizontal plane, of learning to be satisfied with the simple things of life, of eating and drinking and being with his family and working and doing it all before the face of God. And none of the other sort of bigger, extravagant, extraordinary things are deeply satisfying. But he finds meaning in the ordinary, everyday things of life lived before the face of God. And I love that theme. It sort of brings life down to enjoy the simple things, stop and smell the roses, enjoy your kids, work hard, and do it all before the Lord to honor him.